Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the third of 4 webinars in our series on smart solar siting for New England. We are American Farmland Trust, Conservation Law Foundation, Vote Solar, Acadia Center, and the Vermont Law School. And today we'd like to share with you what we've learned over the past 2 years, seeking to find ways to reduce conflicts over the siting of solar projects in New England. I also want to take a brief moment to thank the organizations who have funded and supported this work: the John Merck Foundation, the Barr Foundation, and the National Agricultural Library. Before we get started, just a few quick logistics. Everyone is muted, so you don't need to do that on your own. If you would like to ask a question, and we hope that you do, or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of that panel allows it to expand and shrink. You should see a question section of that panel. You can pop that section out or leave it there, but we ask that you type all of your questions in there. All of us up here will receive your questions. No one else will see them, but don't worry, they're making it to here. And then during the Q&A portion at the end of this, we will get to as many of those questions as possible. We are recording this webinar and we'll make it available online, usually just within a day or two, and we will send a reminder out prior to the next webinar that is available. So with that, Beth, if you could move to the next slide. So I just want to take a very brief moment, because this is our third webinar, to just give the super quick overview that we've been doing this for about 2 years now, and we've been working together and convening quite a number of stakeholders to get their views on how we can both balance solar and land conservation and good policy and practices and guidelines in New England. Go ahead, next, Beth. As I mentioned, today is 3 of 4. We had the balancing land conservation last week. We had sort of a lay of the land the week before, and next week we'll be looking to really turning state and local priorities into sound policy, so some action steps that we hope to help you with. But today, we have growing the solar market with smart siting, and we have 2 great panelists with us today. That's Dave Gall from SIA and Jeannie Oliver from Vermont Law, who will be speaking later on. Go ahead, Beth. So quickly today, we'll do brief introductions. We'll talk about the status of the solar markets in New England, policies that can accelerate it, looking at the cost drivers, and then take a look at a really interesting Vermont law project on low-income solar, and then we will get to our panel Q&A. So now that I've been talking for a few minutes, I'll introduce myself. I'm Emily Cole. I am the Climate and Agriculture Program Manager for American Farmland Trust here in New England. I work mostly on the solar siting issue and on soil health and farmland. So welcome here today, and then I will pass it to next in line, which would be Genevieve.
Hi, my name is Genevieve Byrne. I'm an assistant professor and staff attorney at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at Vermont Law School. And I also work under our Farm and Energy Initiative, which is a collaboration between the Institute for Energy and the Environment and our Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at the law school. We're funded by the National Agriculture Library, and so I've been really looking at the policy part of this project over the last couple of years. And I'll pass it to Deb.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, Deborah Donovan. I am the Massachusetts Director and a Senior Policy Advocate for Acadia Center. We are a regional clean energy and climate advocacy organization doing research and policy advocacy on the clean energy and climate space. And I focus on our Massachusetts efforts in the legislature and regulatory programs, and I'm also focusing on how clean energy resources can better participate in wholesale electricity markets.
Thanks, Deb. Go ahead, Phelps.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Phelps Turner. I'm a senior attorney at Conservation Law Foundation. CLF is a regional nonprofit environmental organization working throughout New England. Through our Farm and Food Initiative, we work to shape and foster a sustainable regional food system to help increase fresh food access, create jobs, and foster healthy communities. And through our Clean Energy Climate Change program, we work to equitably decarbonize our economy, advocating for policies and projects that boost low-cost, locally made clean energy and save families and businesses money. And we're proud to be a partner in this collaborative effort.
Thanks, Phelps. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey everybody, my name's Sean Guerin. I'm the Senior Director for the Northeast for Vote Solar. We're a nationwide nonprofit advocacy group working to make solar affordable and accessible for everybody. We see solar as a pretty neat solution for a lot of the problems we're facing as a nation, and a couple of those are land conservation and supporting local agriculture. And so excited to work to make solar a powerful tool for positive change and well balanced with those concerns.
Thank you, Sean. So now let's go to our guest today. Dave, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, I'm Dave Gall, the Senior Director of State Affairs for the Solar Energy Industries Association. I work on the state team and manage and direct all of our regulatory and legislative work in the Northeast. Our priority states are New York, Massachusetts, and Jersey, but we take positions in other jurisdictions as well. And I think a lot of people are familiar with SEIA, but we're the National Trade Association for the solar industry. We represent, all firms from the companies that manufacture solar panels to project installers to the bankers and the lawyers that help make solar deals happen. So we cover the gambit, and happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you for being here today. And last but not least, Jeannie Oliver, go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeannie Oliver. I'm a staff attorney and assistant professor at the Institute for Energy and the Environment with Genevieve Byrne. And more specifically, I work in the energy clinic with law students and master's students to do transactional law and regulatory advice for clients. My main area of work over the last couple of years has been in bringing community solar to low-income residents in New Hampshire. So that's where I specialize in at the moment, but also doing renewable energy projects for small farms and small businesses in the region as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thanks everyone for being here today, and thank you attendees for also being here today. And we're going to take a moment and pause before we move into the programming to remember a prior partner of this project. So Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the loss of a friend and partner I know all of us and a former core partner in this effort, Erika Nadowski. Deborah is a former colleague of hers at Acadia Center. Do you want to take a minute?
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you everybody for just taking a moment to send our thoughts and to Erika's partner, her family, and all of us that really admired and valued having her as a friend and a colleague. She most recently worked at the Coalition for Community Solar Access, and previous to that was one of my colleagues at Acadia Center. And I just feel very fortunate that I did have time to get to know Erika and work with her and really valued the just her unrelenting idealism and her high expectations that she brought to everything that she did, and also just her determined sense of justice that she brought to her work and her relationships. She had a very stellar history as a journalist before moving into the clean energy and justice space. And I did want to mention for folks who are interested that in support of a cause that was very close to Erika's heart, there is a GoFundMe, a memorial fund in Erika's honor, where 100% of the funds will be going to the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, whose mission it is to promote a safe and healthy environment for all people. And Emily's going to paste that into the chat box, and I just wanted to thank everyone. We're going to just pause for a moment here before we shift to our program for the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for that. We'll go about our business today knowing this was a deep passion of Erika's, and she contributed a lot to the work we'll be talking about today and on this whole webinar series, and certainly would want us to get on with the show. Now we thought we'd kick it off with a little bit of a poll to get a sense of what you all think solar should make up in our energy mix by 2040. So if you can go ahead and select one, we'll see what the audience thinks. And while we're doing this, I'll just set the stage a little. We've talked at great length in the last couple webinars about why this project is so important. And today we're really going to focus on why we need to be stepping on the gas when it comes to solar development in New England. And the importance of making sure that while we're balancing with land conservation and agriculture in the region, we do need to be immediately growing our solar market and solar adoption in this region to address climate change, meet state goals and targets, and to develop this industry in the region. So looking at the poll results, it seems that a fair number of people, the most 39%, thought about 50% of our energy mix in 2040 makes sense. I'll say I'm partial to that answer. It's both solars thought nationally that solar should make up 50% by around then. And then quite a few people said 33% and 75%. Just a few came in with 20 or lower. Don't worry, your answers are anonymous. So with that, I'm gonna hand this off to Dave Gall to give us a little sense of where we're at in terms of solar development in the region and how we got here.
Great, thanks, Sean. Appreciate the introduction, appreciate the opportunity to speak here today again. So why don't we move on to the next slide, please. This is a nice follow-up to the poll that we just took, because I thought it'd be helpful to start with the Solar Energy Industry Association's goals for the next decade for solar and how we intend to achieve those goals. So in September of 2019, we published a report, a roadmap document, essentially, that established the goal of getting 20% of US electricity from solar by 2030. And we're roughly at about 2 to 3% now, so that's a big increase. And to achieve that goal, we established 4 basic work streams, or thrusts of effort. And the first is trying to capitalize on market accelerators. So increasingly, what we're trying to do is ensure that solar projects are paired with energy storage. We're going to be working closely with partners across the country to increase the amount of solar that is on the system, and work for strong public policies to ensure that solar can be installed and can be competitive. And then finally, we wanted to manage our growth, and that's kind of what ties back to this conversation. By managing our growth, we mean, we want to ensure that that solar products and solar component equipments are recycled responsibly at the end of their useful lives. And we also want to make sure that solar projects are sited appropriately and responsibly as well. So we've spent a lot of time thinking through some of these issues around solar siting in various jurisdictions around the country. Next slide, please. Okay, the next couple of slides explain essentially the drivers of the solar market. What's been going on with the larger economic trends, and then what's been going on the policy front to help encourage solar installations. So this slide tackles some of the economics, and want to focus your attention on that yellow line. So in 2010, the blended average cost of a solar system was, between probably about $6 a watt. By 10 years later, we're looking at a blended average cost that's below $1.50 a watt. So that's a 70% decrease in the cost of solar equipment, and that has led to a huge number of installations of solar projects across the country. So The blue bars on the slide represent the installations by year, and I think the trajectory is pretty obvious there. We've seen a lot more growth in solar, and with the expectation in 2020 that we'll have another 18 gigawatts worth of solar projects that are installed this year. So decline in prices has led to a big uptick in installs. And another point to be made here too is that at below $1.50 a watt, and when you translate that up into an average system size for a utility scale project, solar is cost competitive with all their resources now. And in some cases, it's the cheapest option. So that's also, you know, an important component when we're thinking about the growth of the solar market. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about the economics. Now we're going to talk a little bit about policy drivers. And this table lists out some of the aggressive clean energy goals that some of the states in the Northeast have set forth. New York, for instance, is seeking to get 70% of its electricity from clean resources by the year 2030. And they have other more aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals. New York is also looking at installing 6 gigawatts of solar by the year 2025. Massachusetts has an aggressive policy as well. They're trying to get 35% of their electricity from clean energy by 2030. And then Massachusetts recently expanded its incentive program for distributed solar called the SMART program. That program supports another, will support 3,200 megawatts of solar in the Commonwealth. So, you know, in addition to falling prices, in addition to cost competitive solar, we have state mandates, state goals that are driving the growth of the solar market. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and this is the result of those twin policies, right? This is the U.S. Solar deployment forecast. Kind of tracks what we saw before in that previous slide. But you see the upward trajectory here. The blue bars at the bottom represent the residential sector, so that's rooftop solar that serves customers directly. The yellow bars represent commercial projects and community solar. And then the blue bar, the light blue bars at the top represent utility scale solar. So those are the large scale projects that are more prevalent in other regions of the country, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, so specifically in the Northeast, what's going on? We have a number of states that have these aggressive policies, and there's been a fair amount of solar activity in many of the New England states and other states in the Northeast. So we have 3 states that are in the top 10 in terms of total installed capacity. New Jersey tops the list at just over 3 gigawatts. Massachusetts and New York are not too far behind. We're going to see these numbers move around a little bit. Maine, over the past couple of years, has taken some aggressive policy actions to promote the solar industry. So we're going to see Maine move up these rankings. Maine's also a hotbed of community solar development, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. And I think it's important to note that in the Northeast, we're really talking about distributed solar as opposed to large scale, utility scale solar. So a large scale or utility scale project is the one that ties directly into the transmission grid, directly into the bulk energy markets. But distributed solar serves customers, it serves homeowners, it serves commercial and industrial operations, and increasingly it is serving more customers through the proliferation of community solar. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so community solar is a relatively new innovation in the solar space. Community solar essentially is an installation or a project is probably 1 to 5 megawatts in size, and the output of that installation, which is remote, is claimed by subscribers. So everybody gets a share of the output from the community solar system. And this is great from the perspective of serving customers that don't have the ability to put solar on their roof, or maybe they're a renter, or there's a variety of reasons why on-site solar doesn't work for some customers. So community solar gives those customers another option. So we've seen a lot of growth in this space over the past 4 years. This slide represents the national installations for non-residential solar projects. And then those yellow bars at the top reflect community solar. So you can see over the past couple of years here, we've had quite an uptick in growth for community solar. Community solar is big in the Northeast. It's big in Massachusetts. It's big in New York. We're starting to see more community solar development in Maine and markets like New Jersey and Illinois as well. So we've seen this trend continue, this industry beginning to grow, and it's going to continue to grow. And these projects are 1 to 5 megawatts in size. We're not the really, really big ones that you see out west, the 100, 200 megawatt variety projects that tie directly into the grid, but these are 1 to 5 megawatt projects. They can still take up a fair amount of acreage. If you're looking at a 5 megawatt project, depending on the conditions and the site-specific factors, it can be 20 to 30 acres of land that's affected from the project. And that's created some of these debates that we've seen about siting practice and what's the best place to actually put some of these installations. And I think in a land-constrained region like New England, it's made some of these siting questions, especially acute. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's played out on the policy front in the next couple of slides here. Next slide. All right, so just recently in Massachusetts, this has been a hot topic because as the solar market has grown and as projects have proliferated around the state, there was some pushback from landowners about where the appropriate places to put solar should be. And so initially, Massachusetts regulators put out a fairly draconian proposal to limit the installations of solar projects in various land types across the state. So I apologize to those of you who are colorblind because this map probably doesn't help you much, but the red areas listed out in that map on the left show where solar would be prohibited from being sited, and then the green, which is a little harder to see, shows where solar could move forward, and it's really only less than 500,000 acres in the Commonwealth where solar could be sited per the initial draft of those regulations. Regulators walked back a little bit from some of that. They made some better decisions when they finalized the regs, but still, this speaks to the fact that these land use debates have become more and more central to the discussion about solar, the growth of the solar market. Next slide, please. Okay. So I guess I wanted to conclude by saying what we need is a lot more solar. Obviously, we need to have if the states are going to reach these aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals, we need all types of renewables. Solar is going to play a big part in that. And these are larger solar projects, medium-sized solar projects, and rooftop projects. So all market segments have to play a role in helping to meet those goals. But at the same time, we need to be smart about where we put these projects, and we need balanced policies and balanced environmental policies to make sure that solar projects are appropriately sited. And so that's what we're working toward at SEIA, and I think it's terrific that we've the partners on this hosting this webinar pulled together some resources and some thoughts about what the best ways to do that. So with that, I will flip the microphone over to Genevieve.
Thank you so much, Dave. So flowing out of what Dave just talked about, I'm going to be going over some of the policies, some of which he's already mentioned, that are working to accelerate solar development across the region. And I just want to note that one of your handouts for this webinar is our Smart Solar Siting Policy Options document that we've developed that will cover some of our sort of smart options, both within the policy topics that I'm covering today and within some extra topics that I'm not going to have time for. So I encourage you to take a look at that. First, I just wanted to touch again on renewable portfolio standards, renewable energy standards, and these procurement mandates for clean electricity. As Dave just mentioned, ambitious state climate and energy goals are really driving solar development, not just in New England, but in several areas of the United States. In addition to these overall goals and timelines for clean electricity consumption, states might have more specific electricity procurement mandates, where they pass a law saying that utilities must obtain 50 megawatts or 400 megawatts of energy from solar within a shorter deadline, usually 1 to 5 years. And then we have a whole series of other climate and energy goals that are also shaping both the energy we use and the way that the grid is managed, from energy efficiency goals and fuel switching to net zero energy building standards, requirements for energy storage, and clean peak and other timing standards. I just want to note that a lot of these goals are not just driving solar development in one particular state, but really having some out-of-state land use and development impacts as well. Next slide, please. So let's just take a quick look at how some of these goals are structured differently across states. This slide does not represent or list the renewable portfolio standards and goals that exist. It doesn't list all of them in New England because there are way too many of them to put on a slide. And so I just selected some that are representative of the different strategies that different states are using. For example, we often see carve-outs for certain technologies within state renewable portfolio standards, which means that a certain percentage of the renewable energy consumed in state must come from the specified technology. When that's solar, we then refer to the RECs, or renewable energy certificates, as SRECs, the eligibility for which will then define the kinds of solar projects that qualify under the carve-out. So New Hampshire has a relatively modest renewable portfolio standard with a very small carve-out for new solar energy of 0.7%. Vermont has a larger carve-out of 10%, but it doesn't just apply to solar energy, but to new distributed generation, which is a much broader category. Maine recently passed a quite ambitious standard of 100% renewable electricity by 2050. And instead of a carve-out, they are using procurement mandates. So the Public Utility Commission in Maine started soliciting bids for 400 megawatts of distributed solar last year. And we hear a lot about RECs, renewable energy certificates, and SRECs, or solar RECs, but Connecticut has something a little different called LRECs and ZRECs, or low and zero emission renewable energy credits, that are a separate category of required energy under their renewable portfolio standard. The utilities pay an incentive to qualifying projects, including solar energy, and the price can actually be quite high. I'm not sure what it is today, but I've seen prices in the $200 to $300 range for LRECs and ZRECs, so that's a fairly substantial incentive. But I want to note that solar isn't the only zero emission technology. Nuclear energy would also qualify for Connecticut's ZRECs. So state decisions about qualifying technologies really can make all the difference in what energy is being incentivized. Massachusetts is probably the best known for its solar carve-outs. It's had a number over the past decade that has had historically high prices for the SRECs purchased by utilities. And as Dave mentioned, most recently is their SMART program, which we'll be talking a lot more about in just a couple of slides. So renewable portfolio standards and other mandates are often setting sort of big targets for a variety of projects in a variety of locations, and really driving renewable energy siting and development across the whole region. The standards often don't have to be met with just in-state energy. New England has a shared transmission grid, And the rule for qualifying energy under these programs is often that it is deliverable to the ISO New England control area or the New England grid. So this means that we regularly trade RECs within New England, and that can separate in-state land use impacts from out-of-state renewable energy benefits. If we're building a project in New Hampshire, for example, and then selling the RECs or the renewableness of that energy to, let's say, Massachusetts utilities. So I encourage you to take a look at the NEPool, the New England Power Pool website, to get a better sense of how RECs move around and how they're traded across states. NEPool registers and tracks all of the RECs in New England, and you can see what projects are qualifying for each tier or class of energy within a renewable portfolio standard for each state, and then where those projects are actually located in the region. And I just want to mention that as I've been looking at these clean energy goals alongside the land use and preferred siting provisions that we've talked about throughout this webinar series, I came to believe that there is a real potential for actually building land use categories directly into the state renewable portfolio standard programs. Imagine if we had a carve out, instead of for solar of a certain size, a carve out for roof mounted solar, or a carve out for alternatively sited solar, like projects on previously developed land. No one is doing that right now, but if we did, it could encourage this type of development, again, across the region rather than just in state. Next slide, please. Next, I want to dig into some of the policies that guide how we compensate projects for energy generation. In the first webinar, I talked about categorizing projects by size, location, or design to target specific types of projects for incentives. And compensation policies are more likely than, let's say, renewable portfolio standards to identify really specific types of projects that qualify, and also to apply to in-state development. So this would include net metering programs and feed-in tariffs. Again, those procurement mandates can also have pretty specific requirements. And they may also include some other per kilowatt incentives, rebates, or subsidies that really try to target specific projects. Next slide. This chart is just attempting to take a quick look at New England's net metering policies. Again, it's impossible to include all of the details that these programs have in a single chart, but I wanted to highlight some of the differences you find in the programs. First, the eligible project size for net metering differs pretty widely across the states, as well as how the programs characterize either eligible customers or eligible project types. So Vermont's net metering program is certainly the most restricted in terms of project capacity. It only allows projects up to 500 kilowatts or half a megawatt. Other states are really allowing net metered projects up to 5 or 10 megawatts. And I think Rhode Island is particularly interesting here because they have a project capacity cap of 10 megawatts, but that works alongside a restriction that the array has to be sized to meet 125% of on-site electricity consumption, which works to sort of match the array size with the customer's electric load. Programs also differ in how they credit excess generation, whether that's at the retail rate or at an avoided cost rate, and whether you would receive a kilowatt hour credit on your bill versus a monetary credit on your bill. Some states are providing really different rate calculations for small versus large projects or for different customer types. And they also differ on how they treat renewable energy certificates and whether those RECs are either retained by the customer or turned over to the utility, and whether that choice would change the customer's rate. Next slide. Since we can't go through every policy, I thought I would just focus on Vermont and Massachusetts as the states in New England with the most complicated net metering policies and tariff compensation rates, as well as having the rates that change the most based on the characteristics of the solar array or based on other choices that are made by the developer. Remember that when we modify rates based on a solar array's size or location or design or based on who is using the energy, we incentivize the choices that get the higher rate. So starting in Vermont, the rate that you would receive for excess generation under Vermont's net metering program basically has 3 steps. You would start with a blended residential rate, which is defined by the Vermont Public Utilities Commission, and then you apply 2 different rate adjusters, the Renewable Energy Certificate rate adjuster and then a siting adjuster. So the Renewable Energy Certificate adjuster changes the rate that you get for excess generation based on whether the customer chooses to keep their RECs or to transfer them to the utility. And if you transfer them to the utility, you get an extra 1 cent per kilowatt hour. But if you choose to keep them, you're going to lose 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is really 4 cents because you're also losing that extra penny that you would get if you transferred them to the utility. The utility does use the RECs for compliance with the Vermont Renewable Portfolio Standard, but when customers transfer their RECs, they lose the ability to make claims about going solar or using solar energy at their home. The second adjuster is the siting adjuster, which is based on both the size of the project and on Vermont's list of preferred sites for solar arrays. Category 1 projects include projects up to 15 kilowatts. Regardless of their location, they receive an extra penny per kilowatt hour. So this category 1 is really a broad incentive for those smaller scale and residential projects. Category 2 goes from 15 to 150 kilowatts in capacity if those projects are located on a preferred site. They get an extra penny per kilowatt hour. Category 3 projects are projects over 150 kilowatts in capacity. Even if they are located on a preferred site, they still are going to lose 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which really highlights Vermont's preference for those smaller projects. And category 4 projects are between 15 and 150 kilowatts in capacity and not located on a preferred site, then you lose yet another penny down to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So looking at what sites are actually preferred, you can see them listed on the slide: new and existing structures, parking lot canopies, brownfields, landfills. It also includes locations that are specifically identified by municipalities through an energy planning process, or locations that a municipality agrees and relevant planning commissions agree are a good site, even if they were not on the original list. And it also includes siting on the same or an adjacent parcel as a customer using more than 50% of the electricity, which is working to incentivize that siting close to load. Next slide. So Vermont gets a little bit complicated with its adders and subtractors, but it's really fairly simple compared to Massachusetts. The Massachusetts SMART program, as Dave mentioned, has a target of 3,200 megawatts of solar development. It's structured as a feed-in tariff with a declining rate offered for each block of 200 megawatts of development. Rates decline by 4% every 200 megawatts, so this really incentivizes being early in line to get your project developed. There's a maximum project size of 5 megawatts, and small projects under 25 kilowatts receive a fixed price for 10 years, while larger projects are going to be receiving a 20-year term. So how do we figure out the rate, and how does that rate change based on project characteristics? Thank goodness Massachusetts have actually developed a calculator to help you figure this out if you look around on the SMART program website. But generally, you're going to start with a base rate, which is not a standard amount, but it changes based on your interconnecting utility and what block you're in or where you are in line for your project development. And once we know the base rate, we apply a multiplier for certain projects under 1 megawatt, and then a series of adders based on project characteristics, and then a Greenfield subtractor based on land use characteristics. And there's really one more step in that we calculate the value of energy generated differently for standalone projects and behind the meter projects. But I'm actually not going to really get into that because I just want to focus on the adders and subtractors that change based on your project type. Next slide. So once we know your base rate, that rate may be eligible for a multiplier right off the bat, with higher multipliers available for smaller projects and projects qualifying as low income. The SMART program defines a number of different, quote, solar tariff generation units in its regulations that are treated differently in terms of the process for qualification and the rates that are available. So if your low income project qualifies here and it's up to 25 kilowatts in capacity, your base rate is going to be multiplied by 230%. It's a pretty big incentive. And if you aren't low income, but you're still up to 25 kilowatts in capacity, the multiplier is 200%. Then you see the multipliers start to decline as the project size increases, until projects between 0.5 megawatt and 1 megawatt are getting 110%, and projects greater than 1 megawatt would just receive the base rate, even though they can still build up additional incentives based on project characteristics. Next slide. And here is where we find the project characteristics that are incentivized through these different adders, which are based primarily on location and off-taker. These adders are not available to projects that are 25 kilowatts or less because they're getting that extra high multiplier at the outset. But even small projects are eligible for the energy storage adder in Massachusetts because that energy storage is such a priority in the state. If your project is bigger than 25 kilowatts, you can build up an incentive through stacking these adders. You would be eligible for one adder in each category. So a location-based adder, an off-taker-based adder, energy storage, solar tracking, and then they have a new pollinator adder that was just added last year. You can see the location-based adders really start to match what you see almost in the Vermont preferred siting list with building-mounted, brownfields, landfills, canopy. They have a floating solar category. And then a special category for agricultural solar, which is where you will find the requirements for dual use or agrivoltaic projects. And these adders also decline over time as as projects get developed in the different categories. Basically every 80 megawatts that gets developed in a specific category would then trigger a slightly lower rate. Okay, next slide. And then, so we have multiplier, we did adders, now we move to a Greenfield subtractor. This is a single per acre subtractor that applies differently depending on what land use category you are in. There are 3 different land uses. The first, category 1, there's no Greenfield subtractor for that. We would want to incentivize these projects. Category 1 includes both agricultural and non-agricultural land uses, generally includes all of the different types of projects that Massachusetts was interested in incentivizing. So again, you see brownfields and landfills, building mounted, dual use, agricultural solar on this list. And you also see smaller scale projects under 500 kilowatts in capacity on the Category 1 list as well. Categories 2 and 3 do start to get dinged by the per acre Greenfield subtractor. A Category 2 project is between 500 kilowatts and 5 megawatts that is sited on land that has not been previously developed, but is in fact zoned for commercial or industrial use. Category 3 are just those projects 500 kilowatts to 5 megawatts that don't otherwise meet the criteria of these other categories, and then they're going to see a 0.001 per kilowatt hour per acre Greenfield subtractor. So this is a ton of information, and Massachusetts has done a great job of developing guidance documents and charts that explain the different aspects of the program in more detail, and I encourage you to check those out. One thing that I think both states are doing right, both Massachusetts and Vermont, is building in regular administrative reviews of their program. Vermont does a review and update every 2 years. Massachusetts just had its 400 megawatt review of the SMART program last year, and sought feedback from stakeholders and adjusted a number of different rates and requirements. I know that different stakeholders have very different opinions about whether the rates and requirements in both programs are right. But we won't ever know if they're right without regular data collection about what kinds of projects we're actually incentivizing and developing under the rules, and a regular process to change what isn't working. Next slide. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend much time on this at all. This is an image of Vermont's process for obtaining a certificate of public good. I really just kind of want you to focus on the color blocks to understand. So every solar project in Vermont requires a certificate of public good. And what these different blocks are showing is that we have a real fast track for ground-mounted projects up to 15 kilowatts and roof-mounted projects up to 500 kilowatts. And then as you get a larger ground-mounted project, your review requirements and the criteria for approval escalate and increase in number based on capacity size. So we talked about sort of changing rates based on project size, location, or design. You can do the same thing within a permitting process and streamline and create different categories, and then apply different requirements, again, based on project size, location. Here we have roof mounted or ground mounted, and design. Vermont doesn't have any specific special design categories built into this, but who knows, maybe we do in the future. The orange and brown line just under the top talks about grid interconnection rules. And I don't have a separate section on interconnection, but I want to make the same point. We've heard time and again how interconnection costs can be really astronomical and the review process can be complicated. So we can use these same concepts of expediting and projects and limiting costs, particularly for small scale and preferred projects, within state interconnection rules. And a number of states have started developing different tiers of requirements with capping fees and timelines for project interconnection as well. Next slide. And as I said, we cannot cover the whole range of policies accelerating solar in New England and really across the country. So I just wanted to flag some additional policies that are worth taking a look at. Community choice aggregation is allowing municipalities or utility customers to go solar or consume renewable electricity while still receiving distribution service from their local utility. So that's another way to promote renewables. Solar zoning, access, and easement rules can make a huge difference in ensuring that solar isn't prohibited in certain areas. Property and sales tax exemptions can make solar cheaper to buy or own over the long term, which is another great incentive. And again, current use taxation rule changes can promote solar, particularly that works with agriculture and supports farm viability. So now I'll turn it back over to Sean to talk about how some of these policies affect the cost of project development and the market for solar more broadly.
Thanks so much, Genevieve. That's a lot of information you packed into that period. So related to a lot of what both Dave and Genevieve have talked about, I want to touch on the costs and revenues of solar projects and how that is impacted by siting and may impact siting of solar projects. So next slide. Real quick, touching on the overall economics of solar projects. You know, we have obviously on one side the costs of solar development, and then on the other, the revenues, the actual income that pays for solar projects. On the cost side, I think of sort of two big categories: hard costs and soft costs. Hard costs are the actual physical cost of the project, so solar panels, steel structural elements, the actual structure of the system. And it's important to note that these costs have been declining over time. Many of them, I should say, panels in particular, as Dave highlighted, have come down over time. Others, though, can fluctuate quite a bit, like steel, especially with new tariffs that have come out in the last few years. We've seen the cost of steel rise, and these costs are a big part of the overall part of the project, or the cost of the project. On the soft cost side, these costs can decline over time, but are often a little more stable and or may rise in time. So this would include things like labor, interconnection costs, permitting, site costs, finance, the sort of intangible things that need to happen to build a solar project. And in particular, I would highlight that there are often a lot of state differences in soft costs in particular. So for instance, in Massachusetts, the cost of labor is quite high because the state requires a certain percentage of workers on every site to be licensed electricians, who are quite expensive. So the cost of installing a solar project in Massachusetts is a little higher due to the labor cost. In Rhode Island, for instance, the cost of land is very high. It's a small state, and land is very valuable. And so that's a place where the soft cost in terms of land procurement is quite high. On the compensation side and sort of revenues, I think of two major categories. And Genevieve touched on this quite a bit. So we have the compensations. This is fair value for the benefits that solar brings to the grid and the state. And in most of New England, that's net metering, but it can also look like a feed-in tariff or a procurement where the state is paying for what it's getting from a solar project. Then we have incentives, which are built usually on top of or mixed in with the compensation for solar. And these are basically programs that are aimed at getting a certain amount of solar developed and pay extra to make that happen. So this is where solar renewable energy credits would exist. The SMART program, which does include a compensation component, but also has an incentive on top of it, and often where there are differentiators for siting. So next slide, please. We partnered with Sustainable Energy Advantage to pull together some research and analysis on the cost of solar projects in New England to better understand what are the drivers of cost and differences in project value or project cost, and then compare some different types of solar siting or design to understand how they compare cost-wise. So we looked at greenfield or undeveloped land, so solar projects that are built on that type of land. We looked at large rooftop projects, then looked at canopied systems. So these would be like you'd put on a parking lot, or in fact, most dual use systems would be canopied, although that was not explicitly what we looked at. Mostly it was parking lots. And then finally, residential rooftop solar, we wanted to understand as well. And we did Sustainable Energy Advantage combined desktop research using existing state and industry data and surveys and interviews of industry leaders to understand changes in that data, nuances, what are some of the driving factors, you name it. So next slide. As you can see here, and including in the handout is a little more information on this research. What we've come to understand is at a high level, greenfield or undeveloped land is the cheapest way to build solar projects, especially at a higher scale. So 2 to 5 megawatt range, you're looking at far and away the least expensive type of solar installation. So rooftop was 114% of the cost of a greenfield development at this scale, and canopied as much as just shy of 200% of the cost of a greenfield developed solar project. And this makes sense. These projects are often relatively simple to build. They require significantly less structure than canopied, less structural design and engineering than rooftop solar, and the cost of the land can be significantly lower as well. One thing I would highlight is also just the accessibility of tracts of land that are at this scale. So if you're looking to build a 2 to 5 megawatt project, you're likely to need anywhere from 10 to 30, 40 acres of land. And the availability of rooftops and parking lots that are that scale are much lower. And you do get economies of scale at that scale. So it's always going to drive towards bigger projects where allowed in the incentive program. I would highlight, though, that the difference in terms of economies of scale is very different based on the types of projects. So it was interesting for me to see that smaller rooftops are, in fact, cheaper than smaller greenfields. And this probably has to do with the structural components. There's a little less structure involved in a rooftop system usually than a greenfield system where you have to drive piles or otherwise anchor the system into the ground. Next slide, please. So next we looked at some of the driving factors for cost differences in solar projects. And we surveyed folks on each of the types of projects we were identifying. So greenfield, larger rooftop, and canopied systems. And 3 things really rose to the top I would highlight. One is interconnection, and Genevieve highlighted this before. Interconnection costs can be an enormous part of a project's overall budget, and they're also a driving factor because they are very unpredictable and often unstable. So we see across the 3 different categories, interconnection was either the first or the second listed factor in terms of why projects would not be successful. It can especially be problematic because A, there's very little, basically no information in terms of mapping what you might expect interconnection costs to be in a given area or part of the grid. There's very little capacity analysis in terms of what the grid can stand with solar development. So when you're building a project, you have a very low level guess about what you might expect for interconnection costs. Even once you get an interconnection agreement from the electric utilities, we found that those agreements are often drastically revised before the end of a project. So you might get quoted $100,000 at the beginning of a project and come actually wanting to interconnect your project, find out that it's $1.5 million. That sort of unpredictability adds a whole other set of costs on top of just the pure interconnection cost, because it means that financing is often harder to come by or costs more money because they know that your project economics may change fairly drastically. We've also seen recently in Massachusetts projects actually being stalled, so they're built and then waiting to actually interconnect and being stalled for months on end. The other two are structural issues. So especially for canopies, the actual structure of the project takes a lot of steel. So that can be very expensive, and the design of the system can be very expensive. And then on rooftops, the actual readiness of the roof, whether it needs to be retrofitted, what kind of piles need to be put in place to keep the solar panels in place and structurally sound through windstorms, or you name it, can make a huge difference. We're seeing a lot of great looking roofs that are just too old or not quite structurally strong enough to withstand a solar project, which can be a huge problem. And of course, permitting and site control. So actually finding a site, securing a lease or control of that site, and then getting that through local permitting and siting is really challenging, which is why we're trying to put a finer point on these policies. Next slide. I will just touch base real quickly. I did look at residential rooftop costs. This is a really different type of market. You're talking about drastically smaller projects on the whole, on average 5 to 7 kilowatts, as opposed to up to 5 megawatts. And as such, and because the values are different in terms of what you're returning to customers and the electric grid, the cost is pretty different too. So from 2017 to 19 in Massachusetts, the average system costs $4 per watt, which, in case you didn't write down all the numbers before, is about 250% the cost for Greenfield. One last thing I want to touch on the next slide, is just the policy takeaways. None of these will be too shocking to anybody, and I have more in the handout. But one is just improving solar siting so that people can better understand what they're going to go through to develop a solar project on land, where they should be building and looking, and creating a site marketplace to interconnect people who want or could house solar with solar developers could be great ways to streamline that process. In addition, properly understanding the cost of rooftop and canopied solars and some of those cost drivers, and then incentivizing to build in those spaces will be critical. So in Massachusetts, they looked at what ideal rooftop solar projects would look like to create their incentive, but didn't necessarily look at what it would cost to actually retrofit roofs in order to be strong enough to keep solar projects. So better understanding that. And then, having strong net metering rules is critical for customer-sited projects like that. And then finally, interconnection needs to be significantly improved so that there's better mapping and understanding of where these projects should be built to reduce interconnection costs, more price transparency and stability, and potentially look at cost sharing some of these grid upgrades with customers. So with that, we're going to move to our last speaker, but before, we wanted to start with a poll. So I think we have another poll coming up. And the question is, what do you think is the most important inequity that might be related to the solar market? We want to understand what people think are the injustices or inequities that exist obviously across our whole economy, but also in solar. So go ahead and pick one of these, understanding they're all important and interesting topics to discuss. And after this poll, we'll be handing it off to Jeannie Oliver to talk a little bit about some of the work that Vermont Law School is doing to address some of these barriers to an equitable solar market. And with that, how are we looking on answers so far? Perfect. So it looks like coming in number one is incentives flowing from taxpayers to higher income customers, which is something that certainly is commonly heard in state houses and regulatory bodies. LMI access to solar due to ownership and physical constraints was also high on the list, as well as rural areas hosting most of the large solar projects, which is a very siting related one. So very interesting. Thanks for that, and I'll hand it off to Jeannie.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again for having me today talking about Vermont Law School's low-income community solar program. So just to repeat what I said at the beginning in my introductions, I am a staff attorney at the Energy Clinic at Vermont Law School, and most of my work focuses on providing legal advice and technical advice to low-income communities that are trying to go solar. And so the theme of today's talk is about accelerating solar in New England, and we can't accelerate solar if our policies are not inclusive. And as it stands today, our solar policies are not as inclusive as perhaps they ought to be. On the left here, I have a table from a chart from a 2019 study that was conducted by Tufts University and the University of California, Berkeley, looking at race and solar adoption, and in particular rooftop solar adoption. And that study found that there were really big inequities when it comes to the adoption of rooftop solar in the United States. I myself haven't had an opportunity to work on those issues at the Energy Clinic so far, but basically what that study showed was that even when you adjust for income levels, there's a really high disparity between solar adoption between different ethnic groups and racial groups. In terms of low-income solar, the work that we've been focusing on has been working with communities called resident-owned communities, and those manufactured housing communities in New Hampshire. There's also ROCs across the United States, and they've been sort of ideal test cases for us to work with to try and apply some of the existing net metering programs, but also to test new policies with state rulemakings as well. It's estimated that up to 50% of US households can't take advantage of conventional net metering programs. And so in that poll before, one of the, I think the most popular answer was the concern about cost shifting. Yes, cost shifting is a potential concern, and it is often the low-income customers who are missing out on the benefits of net metering. And so through our work, we're trying to right that injustice. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Yeah. So what are some of the barriers to low-income solar? And this is just some that we've identified through our work. There are siting barriers, financial barriers, and informational barriers. The siting barriers, that relates to things such as, the roof not being suitable for accommodating rooftop solar, perhaps not having access to sufficient land or the right sun-facing type of land, not having home ownership. Those sorts of issues come up frequently with our low-income solar projects. Financial barriers, this is obviously also a big one. Solar costs a lot of money up front, and the communities that we work with generally don't have the kind of money sort of sitting around in savings accounts to contribute to a solar project. The existing tax incentives, so the investment tax credit, is not structured in a way that low-income households or nonprofits even can take advantage of, because they simply don't have sufficient tax appetite to take advantage of that. They may not have really robust credit ratings, and therefore that makes it harder to either get loans to do a direct ownership model of solar or to be attractive to solar developers in a power purchase agreement arrangement. Informational barriers that relates to sort of the idea that perhaps the solar industry isn't doing as much outreach to low-income households, and that there's just not as much knowledge about how to take advantage of existing net metering incentives. Next slide, please. So some of the policy solutions that we've seen being implemented already are, and I think the most important one relates to the siting barrier, is having virtual net metering and group net metering policies. Because of the potential issue with not either owning your home or having, you know, a robust roof or having sufficient land to site a solar array, being able to take advantage of off-site solar arrays or shared solar arrays is really critical to bringing the benefits of net metering to low-income households. And it's the program that we work with when we do our community solar projects. In terms of addressing some of the financial barriers, this is not something that currently exists, but changing the investment tax credit to a refundable tax credit would be super helpful, so that it's not only people with sufficient tax appetite that's able to take advantage of that tax credit, and it's a big chunk of the cost of a solar project that's left on the table if a low-income household or a low-income community wants to do a community solar project or a solar project without engaging a tax equity partner. Some states, like New Hampshire, have LMI adders. So that's an adder that goes on top of the base net metering rate. And the New Hampshire LMI adder went into effect this year, and we're just now starting to work with that on some of our projects. Other ideas that people have had are solar loan guarantees, perhaps grants or philanthropic money for low-income solar projects, and then working in partnership with impact investors in PPA models, so power purchase agreement models, so that you're taking advantage of those investment tax credits, but the impact investor, so that's an investor that has more of a philanthropic bent to them, is passing on the investment tax credit savings to the community. And then relating to informational barriers, one idea that's sort of thrown around is that of seeding. So that's the idea if one person in the community goes solar, then that will inspire other people in the community to go solar. It will give them more information about the opportunity. And we've certainly seen that with our low-income solar projects, where publicity about our first project inspired a second community to reach out to us and see if they were potentially able to do a project too. So next slide. So the New Hampshire low-income community solar projects, these are the projects that we've been working on for the last 3 years in partnership with Rock New Hampshire. We work with resident-owned communities. As I said before, that's a manufactured housing community where all of the residents have basically bought the underlying land, so they're not renting the land as they would in a normal mobile home park situation. They are assisted by Rock New Hampshire and the Community Loan Fund to help make that a reality. Our projects all use group net metering in New Hampshire. That program's been strong since about 2013, I believe. And in terms of financing solutions, we've been working with the Public Utilities Commission. They have the Renewable Energy Fund, which has been doing community solar grants for low-income communities for the last 3 years. And through that process, we've been able to get 3 grants to fund 3 projects in 3 different communities. Our first grant only partially funded a project, and in that project, we used the grant money to buy down the PPA rate with a developer, so it was a third-party ownership model. Our other 2 projects, the PUC grants were able to fully fund the projects. For 2 of those projects, we're able to take advantage of New Hampshire's LMI adder. So the LMI adder in New Hampshire is an additional 3 cents a kilowatt hour for projects up until July next year, July 2021, and then it's 2.5 cents thereafter. As I said before, we've worked with impact investors. Our first project was a power purchase agreement model. We worked with Revision Energy, and in that model, they passed on the investment tax credit savings and agreed to take a lower return on investment for this project. The way we structure the projects, and I'll show you a chart on the next slide when we get to it, is so in New Hampshire, until this year, group net metering was administered where the utility would give one net metering check to the host each month, and then the host would distribute to all of the group members in whatever percentage they were, a member of that group. The problem with that for low-income projects is that it could sort of trigger something called the benefits cliff, where if some of the participants are sort of teetering on the edge of being low income and not low income, and therefore eligible for benefits or not eligible for benefits, that extra income could sort of tip them above that line. To avoid that, we structured it so that the participants receive lot rent reductions, which is a reduction in their expenses rather than income. And that's been very successful so far with these projects. The other benefit of that is, whereas the net metering credits are a little bit variable each month, less in the winter, more in the summer, the lot rent reduction is structured so that it's an equal amount each month throughout the year. And then we do an annual adjustment to make sure that we haven't overpaid or underpaid. And then for the information solutions, the partnership with ROC New Hampshire has been very important. ROC New Hampshire works very closely with the communities, so they have a good relationship with them, they've earned their trust, and that's been incredibly important to making these projects successful. There's been a lot of VLS Energy Clinic involvement as well. So one of the challenges with these projects is when you're receiving money from the state in the way of grants, there's a lot of administrative burden. And so we're working closely with the communities to make sure that that administrative burden is not too heavy to bear. A lot of reporting and annual income surveys. And then sort of repeating what I said before, using sort of successful projects as an opportunity to do seeding, so to inspire other communities to also try and go solar through community solar projects. Next slide, please. So this is just a diagram of how our projects work. I just wanted to show this is our third-party ownership model, or our power purchase agreement model, where we had an impact investor. So this is just showing the different way that the money flows. So the utility pays the money to the host pays a power purchase agreement amount each month, and then distributes the balance as a lot rent reduction. Now this chart changes a little bit with the LMI adder, where some of the net metering credits will go directly to participating households as on-bill credits, because the LMI adder statute required that, but the bulk of it will still be distributed as lot rent reductions, because our community members have a general preference for that sort of stable, even monthly reduction in expenses. And then the next slide shows the turnkey model or direct ownership model. So we have two projects where the community itself owns the solar array, but it works, in exactly the same way. There's a one-off payment upfront using the grant funds to the solar installer for an engineering, procurement, and construction agreement, but otherwise the money is flowing from the utility and then being distributed as lot rent reductions, or as the case is going to be now, partially as lot rent reductions and partially as on-bill credits. And so I think I've used up most of my time, but I'm happy to take questions. It's probably the easiest way to talk about these projects anyway. So I hope that was interesting to everyone.
Very interesting, very helpful. Thank you, Jeannie.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie, and thanks for everyone for being here. So we're going to take some Q&A. Just a reminder, if you go over to your dashboard and you open the questions section, that's where you can type some in if you have them now. Excuse me, we've been getting quite a few, so we have a few queued up and we're ready to roll. Take it away, Sean.
Thanks. So first one is just at a high level, I think, a framing question. if we don't have the right balance between conservation and solar development and agriculture, should we be pausing solar programs or solar policies in order to figure that out? So I'll start with that. I'm curious, I know Phelps, you've put some thought into this, and then perhaps Dave could come from an industry perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to get the conversation going. I think that it's a great question, and certainly as we've heard from all our panelists today, there's a lot of complicated and fairly new and nascent policies and programs here, and there's certainly going to be a learning curve, and there will be some growing pains. But I don't think that that's a reason to necessarily pause. In particular, because of the climate crisis, time is of the essence. And I think we need to go through some of those growing pains and travel on the learning curve toward better designed policies and programs. So for instance, Genevieve mentioned the procurement that was recently undertaken here in Maine, and there were some issues with the first go around, and they're going to adjust and do the procurement again. But I think that the climate crisis is too important to put things on pause. I would love to hear what others think.
Yeah, I'll disagree with that. I think I'm a climate change guy at heart. I got into this business because of the challenge that we're faced with here, and we can't afford to push the pause button and slow down development. We need massive amounts of clean energy. We're going to have to figure these policies out on the way and on the fly. So it's up to us to come up with good recommendations and come up with a framework that allows for these projects to continue to be built, and so we can meet this challenge.
Thanks. We had a few questions about the role that storage and wind power play in our energy mix, or the role that they could play. Obviously, this is a very solar-focused panel and discussion, but I'm curious, Deborah, if you all have done a fair amount of modeling of energy systems, what you think about that.
Well, I'd like to say that just building on what Dave just mentioned is that when we look ahead to the need to rapidly electrify all sectors of our economy, that solar energy and solar development is going to contribute significantly to our ability to achieve those goals. And those resources, particularly solar resources, are going to have the most value in our regional electricity system if they're paired with storage as well. There's been, a pretty exciting development recently, a positive development coming out of FERC, where aggregations of distributed energy resources, including solar storage or paired projects, are going to actually be able to participate in the wholesale market the same way that the larger generators have in the past. So that is it's a very promising development, and I would say that at any time that we can create market rules or incentive programs that encourage the development of solar and storage together, or the development of wind and storage together, that just really will increase the effectiveness of those resources in serving needs of the system, throughout the day, throughout the seasons that, as the fluctuations that we know are going to come in load and in the energy production from these kind of resources.
Obviously, interconnection came out a few times in the discussion, and there were a few questions about it as well. Definitely some frustration experienced in the questions. Perhaps, Dave, you could take this one first, but would also be curious, Genevieve, your thoughts on why are interconnections so high, and what is being done or could be done to fix that?
Sure, I'll get it started. I mean, I think there are sort of three issues here. Number one, the grid is old, and there is just a general need in New England for infrastructure upgrade. Two, I think the unpredictability of the process for interconnection projects has increased cost, it increases financing costs. That's a big issue. And then third, I think the old model with the costs being with the developer, the project developer being responsible for those costs exclusively of upgrading the system, needs to be reconsidered. So, we need to upgrade the grid fast. Maybe we need a better way to allocate those costs among different parties so that the developer, maybe the utilities are all sharing some of those costs. And then we need, clearer rules about process and timelines and how this is supposed to work, and expedite the connection of these projects.
Yeah, I would say I entirely agree with what Dave has already mentioned. I don't have the details in front of me, but a number of states have started creating tiers of projects that go through different interconnection processes with different potentially capped costs on interconnection and timelines for utility review of those interconnection applications. And I think all of that can help. I think we also need to address the issue of sort of the project that broke the grid's back, where like one project ends up being responsible for a major upgrade when potentially a number of projects have in the queue before that contributed to the need for that upgrade, to sort of more equitably divide those costs of upgrades among the participants.
Just one added thought, if I may, is that this applies to many parts of our system, but the compensation issue of what are utilities motivated to do? They're motivated to do the things that they get paid for. And so taking a step back and looking at what the incentive structures are and the compensation structures are for utilities, I think will lead to a really productive conversation that Dave hinted at, which is who's paying for this and who's benefiting from it, and so we're definitely looking forward to reframing those kind of questions in many of the venues where these questions about interconnection are getting resolved, among other things.
Is it okay if I just add one thought on the low-income projects here too? So interconnection costs is actually one of the challenges that we've faced with grant-funded projects. So with those projects, we go for a request for proposal process with developers, which try to predict what the interconnection costs will be. And then the grant funds that we've received from the Public Utilities Commission have been based off those proposals. Unfortunately, for at least 2 out of our 3 projects so far, the interconnection costs have actually come in much higher than the initial estimates. And that means that either the community ends up having to pay for it out of pocket because there is no more grant funds that you can get for that sort of cost overrun, or it increases the power purchase agreement price. So this has also been a bit of a problem with our low-income projects.
Yeah, the compounding financing issues when you already have tough to finance projects are really powerful. Well, we have a trillion good questions, but I think we should probably wrap up here, and we will definitely keep those questions in mind for our 4th and final webinar. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Sean. I just want to take a moment to thank our guests for coming here today, Dave Gall and Jeannie Oliver. Thank our panelists for sharing this wonderful information, and alert you to next week's final in the series, which is Turning State and Local Priorities into Sound Policy, where we will hopefully be able to dive in, not hopefully, we will dive into some of the next steps that you can take and some of the ways you can step back and really evaluate how can smart solar siting help you, your locality, your state meet their goals. Next week's is on Thursday, so it's different than this week and the 2 prior ones, so just make note of that. And you can find the recording of both this webinar and prior webinars on the Smart Solar Siting for New England free webinar series site. Also, since you are registered, you'll get a reminder before the next webinar that will have that link in it as well. Thanks again for everybody attending today. You want to wrap up to the next slide, Beth? And just a quick thank you again to our funders, and looking forward to wrapping this all up. This series is 2 years of work next Thursday at noon. Hope to see you all here. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.